In this video, we will discuss U.S. expansionism, the movement to expand beyond our borders and acquire overseas colonies. The idea of manifest destiny and expansion did not stop when the U.S. reached the Pacific Ocean. Many Americans desired to continue expansion, and a war with an old European empire gave us the opportunity to do it. Americans will struggle with becoming a world power, fighting a second war to put down a rebellion. This period represents a steep departure from our historically isolationist policy, and will put us in position to compete with European powers on the global stage. American foreign policy has been based entirely upon two major policy decisions. Since 1796, the U.S. has continued the recommendation of outgoing President George Washington, who stated in his farewell address that the country should avoid entangling alliances. Washington knew that Europe was unstable and frequently at war. He recommended that the U.S. not form any permanent alliances with any European power, because it could pull us into war. At the time, the U.S. was in its infancy and unable to compete militarily with powerful nations like Britain and France. Washington's proclamation of neutrality was a bold but necessary move to keep the country safe. This policy grew into isolationism, a policy of avoiding intervention with the affairs of other countries. The second major foreign policy initiative of the United States was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Written by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, it proclaimed that the Western Hemisphere was under the protection of the U.S. It outlawed European colonization and interference in the affairs of any country in the Western Hemisphere. The main goal of this policy was to prevent countries like Great Britain or Spain from trying to reclaim lost territory in Central and South America, thereby threatening the U.S. These two policies were the cornerstones of U.S. foreign policy for over 100 years. Imperialism explodes during the early 20th century for many reasons. Improvements in transportation and communication, growth of entertainment and consumerism, and new energy sources causes global trade to double every 20 years. Population growth, especially in Europe and the US, forces countries to look outward for additional resources and markets. Europe's population increases by 250%, especially in Russia, Germany, Britain, and France. The US quickly grows to have the third highest population in the world. Industrial growth produced a great need for markets and resources, but not colonies in the old sense of the word. Colonies were expensive to maintain, protect, and govern. Powers fought over them, natives rebelled against them. Puppet governments, spheres of influence, and protectorates replaced colonies. A strong sense of nationalism produced great economic competition between Germany, England, France, and Russia. As you can see in the cartoon, the major European powers are taking over the world, and the US wants to join the party. Religious zeal creates a strong push to civilize and Christianize inferior peoples around the world, a concept known as white man's burden, based on the poem by Rudyard Kipling. This was also fueled by social Darwinism, scientific racism, and beliefs of racial superiority. There were three major causes to U.S. imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The first was economic. The closing of the American frontier in 1890 meant that the U.S. needed to look overseas to find more resources to continue industrial growth. Improvements in technology increased the manufacturing capacity of the U.S., which meant we needed more markets to sell our finished goods. Overseas markets could provide the outlet we needed to continue economic growth. The U.S. was engulfed in the Panic of 1893, the worst economic depression in history up to that point. The American people needed a distraction, and overseas conflicts provided a unifying distraction to problems at home. Finally, the U.S. wanted to compete with European powers for markets, colonies, and investments overseas. The second cause was social. Social Darwinism in the U.S. had some believing in the concept of scientific racism, that some groups were superior to others. Indigenous peoples of Asian islands could be controlled by the United States. Americans felt they had a duty to civilize and Christianize the barbaric peoples of the world, the concept known as white man's burden. Finally, the third cause was political. The U.S. needed a larger navy to protect both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. One thing that may help that is an Isthmian Canal through Central America, to allow for the movement of ships between both coasts. Colonies and coaling stations would allow Americans to create an empire to compete with British as a world power. To facilitate these colonies, we need a large merchant fleet and a large modern navy. Finally, all of this is motivated by the idea of jingoism, or extreme nationalism. The U.S. feels it's the greatest nation in the world, and that our system is superior to all others. We want to put our imprint on the world. In 1890, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, a lecturer in naval history and the president of the United States Naval War College, published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a revolutionary analysis of the importance of naval power as a factor in the rise of the British Empire. Mahan argued that British control of the seas, combined with a corresponding decline in the naval strength of its major European rivals, paved the way for Great Britain's emergence as the world's dominant military, political, and economic power. Mahan and some leading American politicians believed that these lessons could be applied to U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the quest to expand U.S. markets overseas. Mahan was one of the foremost proponents of the vigorous foreign policy. Mahan believed that the U.S. economy would soon be unable to absorb the massive amounts of industrial and commercial goods being produced domestically, and he argued that the United States should seek new markets abroad. What concerned Mahan most was ensuring that the U.S. government could guarantee access to these new international markets. Securing such access would require three things: a merchant navy, which could carry American products to new markets across the great highway of the high seas, an American battleship navy to deter or destroy rival fleets, and a network of naval bases capable of providing fuel and supplies for the enlarged navy and maintaining open lines of communication between the United States and its new markets. Other notable architects of expansion included William Henry Seward and James Blaine. William Seward was Secretary of State for President Lincoln and Johnson. While the U.S. was occupied with the Civil War, Napoleon III sent troops to Mexico. After the war, Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine and threatened U.S. military action unless France withdrew. Napoleon backed down and his troops left Mexico. Seward is also known for the Alaska Purchase Treaty of 1867. Russia offered to sell Alaska to the U.S. in 1859, but the U.S. was about to be involved in the Civil War, so it was delayed. The offer was renewed after the war in 1867, and the Senate approved the treaty to purchase Alaska for $7.2 million. The purchase was ridiculed in Congress as Seward's folly, Seward's icebox, and President Andrew Johnson's polar bear garden. Secretary of State James "Jingo" Blaine was Secretary of State for Presidents James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, and Benjamin Harrison. He promoted the idea of Pan-Americanism to bring peace in North and South America and cultivate friendly economic ties with all American countries. His goal was to increase U.S. markets in Latin America to resolve trade deficits. The Venezuelan boundary dispute officially began in 1841, when the Venezuelan government protests alleged British encroachment on Venezuelan territory. In 1814, Great Britain had acquired British Guiana by treaty and with the Netherlands, and the British established a boundary that effectively claimed an additional 30,000 square miles for Guyana. In 1876, Venezuela protested, broke diplomatic relations with Great Britain, and appealed to the United States for assistance, citing the Monroe Doctrine as justification for U.S. involvement. Finally, in 1895, the U.S. demanded that the British submit the boundary dispute to arbitration or negotiation. The British refused. President Cleveland and Secretary of State Olney argued that the Monroe Doctrine applied to this situation and were ready to back it up with military force. Great Britain and Venezuela finally entered into negotiations. The commission appointed by the Americans ruled in favor of the new British boundary, which disappointed the Venezuelans. Despite the loss, the Venezuelans were happy the U.S. intervened on their behalf. Of far greater significance, the incident marked the United States as a world power and gave notice that under the Monroe Doctrine it would exercise its claimed control of the Western Hemisphere. This would also serve as a turning point in U.S.-British relations. From 1895 onward, the Brits would cultivate a U.S. friendship which would aid them significantly in the two world wars. Hawaii sugar plantations were owned by a small minority of white Americans. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 put a damper on sugar profits because Hawaii was not a U.S. territory and thus subject to the tariff. American sugar plantation owners wanted to solve this problem by having the U.S. annex Hawaii, but Queen Liliuokalani refused. She insisted that Native Hawaiians should control the islands. A small band of plantation owners organized a successful revolt in 1893, aided by an unauthorized use of American troops who had stopped at Honolulu's refueling station. The Republican-controlled Senate tried to push annexation through Congress, but Democratic President Cleveland refused to sign the bill. The Hawaiian question would have to be put on hold until 1898, when Republican President McKinley will use the U.S.-Philippine War as a pretext to annex Hawaii. Meanwhile, in Cuba in 1894, the American tariff restored high duties on Cuba's sugar production. This led to an open revolt in 1895. The Cuban insurgents adopted a scorched earth policy, hoping that if they did enough damage, Spain would leave, or the United States might move in and help the Cubans win their independence. Here are three more architects of expansion. First up is Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. He was an expansionist who believed in American superiority and the right to continue expanding. He also produced the Lodge Corollary, that Latin American countries could not sell any territory to non-European countries. Next is Frederick Jackson Turner. If you remember, he wrote his thesis on the closing of the frontier. He argued that the U.S. must expand outward because there were fewer economic and social opportunities for Americans now that the West is closed. Finally, Reverend Josiah Strong was a proponent of expansion who used social Darwinism as a justification. He believed in white man's burden, the idea that the culture and institutions of the U.S. were superior to all others. Strong wanted to spread American Christianity and culture to the indigenous peoples of the Pacific. The main architect of expansion was Theodore Roosevelt. He served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Vice President, and would become President in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley. Roosevelt believed that the U.S. was destined for greatness, and that to achieve that greatness, it must expand. Like Mahan, he wanted a new, powerful navy to facilitate his new foreign policy. His foreign policy became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that the U.S. would become the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, willing to use its new navy to protect its interests in Latin America. Roosevelt saw the importance of the Pacific region to American interests. He saw Germany and Japan as the biggest rivals to American interests there.